Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the pesticides session for the ITEC conference. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a couple quick logistics. Attendees, you will not be able to unmute yourself, and you will not be able to see other attendees that are joining. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our first presenter, Dr. Ed Spevek with the St. Louis Zoo. Dr. Spevek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be presenting on a new initiative we started several years ago here at the St. Louis Zoo called Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators as part of our Center for Native Pollinator Conservation. But first, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the St. Louis Zoo is located in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Osage Nation in the Atlantic Confederacy. We also acknowledge that the area and parts of Missouri have been traditionally used by others, including the Pawnee, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Oto, Missouri, Omaha, Iowa, Quapaw, Chickasaw, Kickapoo, and the Haudenosaunee. The process of knowing and acknowledging the ground beneath our feet is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the people on this land before us. It familiarizes visitors with the cultures and histories of Missouri's indigenous tribes, as well as with their ties in the St. Louis region. We honor our heritage of Native peoples and what they teach us about stewardship of the earth. So the program that we started is really about relationships and everything being connected, because we are part of everything that is beneath us, above us, and around us. It's our past, our present, our future, and also, as many know, that's 7 generations past and present. It's also focused a lot on food and food sovereignty, because the recovery of people is tied to recovery of food, since food itself is medicine, not only for the body, but also for the soul and spiritual connection to history, ancestors, and the land. So, as I said, several years ago, the St. Louis Zoo's Wild Care Institute Center for Native Pollinator Conservation started the Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators initiative. And what it is, it's focused on that intersection of wild and cultivated foods, cultural traditions, food sovereignty, healthy environments, and people, and the environment is represented by pollinators. This graphic really kind of shows you those interrelationships, how everything is connected. So nature, which includes the pollinators, is connected to food, is both cultivated and wild, is connected to health of people, it's connected to culture. Cultures and traditions are connected to health and food. Everything is interconnected. And this is how we look at our program, as everything is being interconnected. We also want to look at how we're growing things and the practices that have changed. Rob Kimmer, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, defines indigenous agriculture as the practice to modify the plants to fit the land, whereas unfortunately today in modern agriculture, we've modified the land to fit the plants. That's why we can grow yellow dent, number 2 corn anywhere, though it isn't necessarily the best corn to grow every place, because we've got to either heavily irrigate, heavily modify the soils, etc., as opposed to growing what has been adapted to the land. When we also look at the change in our food, we've lost a lot of nutrition from traditional and wild varieties to more cultivated. If you look at corn, and you look at the way of anthocyanins, a phytonutrient, very high levels in blue corn. But when you look at our current white corn that you can buy in most grocery stores, there's very little nutritional component to it. Looking at berries, chokeberries, much higher in antioxidants than even blueberries, because we've modified blueberries to be more either palatable or grow in better conditions. And we've lost a lot of that nutrition. But when we look at the relationship of food, it's also about the animals that interact with it. So as Winona LaDuke has pointed out, food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. That is how we consider food. Food has a culture, it has a history, it has a story, it has relationships. And the relationships that we talk about a lot are the relationships of pollinators to the food. So when you look at a lot of varieties of different types of foods, wild varieties, you can see the variety of different types of pollinators. When we look at things like bee balm, wild bergamot, Oswego tea, you can see bumblebees, you can see large carpenter bees, you can see small resin bees, purple poppy mallow, you can see cuckoo bees, small carpenter bees, bush morning glory, manroot, mealyus, wild potato vine. This is a specialist called Melatomatoria or sweet potato vine bee. Spring beauty or prairie spud, that early spring ephemeral that comes up in March and early April, a tiny little flower, attracts a lot of different bees, and one specialist in the lower right, which is Andrea aeruginea, which is a specialist on that flower. So both by pollinating the flower, it survives, and you need that flower for it to survive also. Prairie parsley or biscuit root. A lot of very small bees like mask bees and small resin bees. Lead plant, tea plant, Indian shoestrings. Here you see a small sweat bee on the left, a leafcutter bee on the right. Common milkweed, a traditional plant used for fiber, but also for food. Here you also see a small resin bee on the left and a bumblebee on the right. Chokeberry, small sweat bee, large carpenter bee, and several species of digger or mining bee. Serviceberry or shadberry, shadbush, juneberry, small sweat bees, and also more mining bees. These mining bees, as family Andrenidae, are some of the best pollinators for our spring shrubs and trees. Blueberries, cranberries, huckleberries. Here you see bumblebee, blue orchard mason bee, mining bee, and in the bottom right is a specialist on blueberries, a southeastern blueberry bee. 90 to 95% of its diet is just blueberry pollen and nectar. So it's that intimate relationship between the bee and the plant. Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke, and annual sunflower. Here you see some more generalist bees like the small carpenter bee in the middle and the bumblebee on the right. But the top right is the sunflower bee, a specialist on sunflower and its relatives. And the two pictures on the bottom left are the sunflower longhorn bee, both the female and the male. Crab apples, choke cherries, wild cherries, black cherries, wild plum, hog plum, Chickasaw plum. A diversity of bees are there for pollinating. And it's really about this bee diversity, which is incredibly important. We often think of, well, we can replace them sometimes with the non-native honeybee. But if you look at each of these bees, each of them works the flower a little bit differently. So you actually improve overall fruit production, overall seed set. So when you see the blue orchard mason bee, large carpenter bee, mining bees, and bumblebees, all of these work the flower a little bit differently and produce a much more nutritious and larger fruit. Cultivated varieties like tomatoes. Honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes because they require what's called buzz pollination. They actually have to be vibrated. So here you've got bumblebees, which are some of the best pollinators for tomatoes. Ground cherries, which are native and tomatillos to the south, but they're all the same genus Physalis. There's a specialist bee, Calides latitarsus, which these two gray images are, and then there's also bumblebee, which pollinate the species. Pumpkins and squashes, all different varieties, both wild type and domestic. On the right are two different species of squash bee, Peponapus pruinosa and Xenoglossus strenua. And on the left, you can see bumblebees and metallic green sweat bees. Beans in general require pollinators, such as the two-spotted longhorn bee on the left or the bumblebee on the right. And even corn, when we don't think about corn as requiring bees, because corn is when pollinated, but how we manage corn can affect bees, because a number of bees will forage for corn pollen, such as the small sweat bee on the top or the two-spotted longhorn, but I've also seen green metallic sweat bees, bumblebees, and even honeybees forage for corn pollen. So how we manage our corn also affects our pollinators. So with all of this information, looking at the plants and the relationship to the bees, the initiative is also focused on the 4 R's of indigeneity. And this is the best way we can describe our actions and how we work. Those ideas of relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. So relationship is that kinship obligation, the profound sense that we human beings are related, not only to each other, but to all things, animals, plants, and rocks. And this idea of the 4 R's of indigeneity comes from a paper published several years ago by LaDonna Harris of the Comanche Nation. And really, for me, spoke to how I can look at the relationship between the environment, the people, and the food. And a good example is this species, the squash bee, which is a specialist on squashes. So when squashes were first cultivated around 10,000 years ago in Mexico, The bee found the cultivated varieties just as good as the wild type. And then as squash cultivation moved throughout North America, the bee actually moved with it and spread throughout North America. You can now find this species throughout most of the United States and even into southern Canada. Right now, it is the only pollinator we know of that's actually moved with agriculture. Whereas we have an idea of moving honeybees to agriculture, this bee has moved with it, and it's one of the best pollinators for squashes. It's amazing. When you plant squashes, this bee shows up. I live in the city of St. Louis, and each time I plant squashes, I have no idea where the nearest patch of squash are, but these bees find my squashes. So it is that interrelationship, and this is why we use this species as the image and part of the logo for our initiative, because it's that intimate relationship between the food, the squash, the people cultivating the squash, and the pollinator, the squash bee. But we need to look at our relationships, because it's not just land that is broken, but more importantly, our relationship to the land. So we have a responsibility to all these other species, and it's that community obligation. We have a responsibility to care for all of our other relatives. And the best example I can see in the way of bees is this species, the rusty patch bumblebee. This is the first bumblebee now listed on the endangered species list. It used to be one of the most common bumblebees throughout the eastern US, but now has declined due to habitat loss, pesticide abuse, and possibly disease from introduced commercial colonies from Europe. But we have a responsibility to take care of this bee and the land that supports it. Reciprocity, the cyclical obligation. Often when I talk to people, they're always thinking about, well, what do I get out of this now? But reciprocity is a cyclical aspect where you may not get something now, but you will get something in the future. So it is a circular relationship, and tomatoes are one of the best examples for this. Sorry about that. So as I said, bumblebees are one of the best pollinators for tomatoes, but the only thing that a bumblebee can get from a tomato is pollen. So in order to supply the rest of its diet, we need to plant other wildflowers for both other types of pollen for it, but also the nectar resource for it to have a complete diet. So by us supplying it a complete diet, it then supplies us in the future with a complete diet by the fruits of its labor through the production of those tomatoes. So we have this reciprocal relationship. As Robin Wall Kimmerer says, each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. Just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I'm in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, then I am responsible for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of a human's education is to know those duties and how to perform them. And as I said, at any given moment, those exchanges are not necessarily even. So, as I said, with the tomatoes, planting additional floral resources for those bumblebees to give them their diet so that they can give us part of our diet in the future. And when we think about bumblebees too, we need to think about their whole life cycle in order to allow them to supply us with a diet. Bumblebees only live for a year. Unlike honeybees, where a queen may live for several years, a bumblebee queen only lives for 1 year. And right now, the colonies are going in the summer, they're all feeding, increasing their numbers, but in the fall, they're going to be producing new queens for the next year. So those new queens need food resources in order to store up energy, just as like when we think of bears storing up energy for the winter, bumblebee queens need to do this too. So those newly bred queens need to feed on things like asters and goldenrod and blazing stars, those fall blooming plants, to store energy for them to overwinter. And then in the spring, they need those spring blooming plants, particularly a lot of trees and shrubs, in order to be able to start their colonies. So if we don't have plants blooming in the spring, they can't start their colonies. And if we don't have plants blooming in the fall, they won't be able to overwinter to be able to start those colonies next year to help pollinate the foods that we need. And redistribution is a sharing obligation. We need to kind of balance our relationship between the land and the animals that use it, the plants that use it, and also our use of that. So when I look at, growing up and I looked at my great uncle's farms, they were very diverse. There was a lot of diverse habitat. But now you look at farm and agriculture, it's monocultures of corn and soy as far as the eye can see. We need to make sure we redistribute and add more habitat for all these other species so that they can survive along with us. And the monarch is probably one of the best examples. As they migrate from Mexico all the way up into southern Canada, they need milkweed in order for their caterpillars to feed. They also need nectar resources for themselves. But a lot of the monarch migration is going through our agricultural belt through the central US. We need to be able to redistribute some of that land for those monarchs. We now see farms that are planted from fence line to fence line. We've lost those roadside verges of milkweed. We've lost those hedgerows. We've lost those edges of milkweed and other nectar plants. We need to figure out how can we redistribute the land, still producing food for ourselves, but also allowing other animals to survive along with us, because it would be a very sad world if we did not have all these other lives along with us. So with that introduction, I want to talk about some of the projects that we're doing with a number of tribes and nations, and it's really focused on what the people need. So we have various resources, we have various abilities, but it really depends upon what the people need. We started out working with the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, but we're now working in a variety of different ways across the United States in everything from education projects to pollinator projects to food projects, depending upon the needs of the people. So as I said, we started off working with the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, and with them, the introduction to the Omaha. We started initially with a 5-acre site on the Winnebago. Half of it we planted in pollinator habitat. The other half, we were able to get a large donation of heirloom corn, bean, and squash seeds from Seed Saver Exchange in Decorah, Iowa, and Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds here in Mansfield, Missouri. We had so many seeds, we were actually able to share with the Omaha and even the Ponca too. We planted the wildflower seeds. We got youth from the community to plant milkweed. We had the Winnebago Wildlife and Parks planting fruit trees, and even the BIA actually helped to water them. Unfortunately, later the BIA did mow down the trees, so we are going to have to replant them. And there were a lot of good signs for this whole project. And we look at those signs along with the elders and others is very important too. So whether double rainbow or the site, the first time I visited the Winnebago and met with one of the elders, 2 eagles flew over side by side, which he said was a very good sign of what was going to happen. We also work in interpreting and telling people what's going on. All the signs we do are written in both the language of the people as well as in English, so that we also create part of that language renaissance too. There's an old orchard on the Winnebago Reservation that has been there for a number of years. Really, it's not being kept up, but we wanted to find out what bees were helping to pollinate them. So one thing we did, we put in a number of bee hotels with Winnebago Wildlife and Parks to start serving some of the bees, particularly one I was looking for, which is the blue orchard mason bee. And through that, we were able to identify the red star, all the stars are where we located the bee hotels. The yellow were those which were occupied by bees, and particularly blue orchard mason bees. So this gives us an idea where to add additional habitat to support those bees. And anecdotally, where you look at those bee hotels that had bees, you had much heavier fruit set in those trees. I had a student last year, Eric Pinto from the Catherine Booter Center for American Indian Studies of WashU, Zuni Choctaw, who helped me put up additional bee hotels to create more habitat for those bees too. They have now, the Winnebago set up a village market to help support all those people who we've been supplying seeds and plants for, and they were nice enough to honor us with a star quilt with the logo of the squash bee and the medicine wheel as part of that. Working initially with Nebraska Indian Community College in the Omaha and a Santee with Monarch Watch, we planted a lot of milkweed on some habitat restoration sites to support monarchs. We supplied them with more seeds and heirloom corn for production on the reservation. We did some bee hotel classes with both gardeners and elders and talking about bee biology, working with the Center for Rural Affairs. And we're also now working on a medicine wheel pollinator garden where each of the quadrants of the medicine wheel will be planted in those plants of those colors, but supporting the pollinators too. So it reinforces the culture and traditions, but then also supports pollinators as well. We've produced a common bee guide that we've used here in Missouri, but now we've used it for outreach and allowed various people to use it. So the Meskwaki, Sac, Fox, Mississippi, Cowina Bay, the Oglala Lakota, the Quapaw, and the Omaha also now use that for education outreach. On Pine Ridge, we started working with Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation with their Director of Food Sovereignty, Nick Fernandez, supplying them with tools, trees, seeds. Nick has now started his own organization working across the reservation called Makoche Agricultural Development. We've continued to support him with additional greenhouse and materials to increase food sovereignty across the reservation. We're also hoping to do some additional education work. Excuse me, the bottom left is the powwow grounds on Porcupine District. And this powwow grounds is directly across from the Porcupine K through 8 school. And what we'd like to do is put in walking trails around the powwow grounds with signage in Lakota and English talking about the plants and the pollinators. But then the school can also use that for science and education outreach because it's literally right across the parking lot from the powwow grounds. We started working with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Nation in Montana. Here we've been working on pollinator habitat restoration and also surveys, non-destructive surveys, identifying what the bees are and seeing how effective different pollinator restoration projects are and how we've got a grant through the St. Louis Zoo to support this. We're also now looking at helping to modify some of the wildlife crossings, which are very good at supporting elk, bear, moose in their migration, but we want to make sure they're also pollinator friendly too, because even a road can be a barrier to a lot of pollinators, even bees, where you may think they can fly over, but they also need those corridors as well. We've done outreach programs through Pawnee Nation College. I did 5 of them this past December on everything from beneficial insects to bee identification to the Native Foods Initiative. We now have a grant through USDA working with NICC and Pawnee Nation College and Rise Veterans Foundation, working with veterans and Indigenous people in Indian country who are interested in farming. I'll be teaching this next month on different aspects of insect science, from bees to soil invertebrates to best farming practices, and all to raise awareness on best farming practices as well as to support sustainable regenerative agriculture. And most recently, we've started working in the urban communities. So here in St. Louis, as a program originally called Pomia Tekoshi in Chickasaw, our little prairie, now being renamed Coloma Orchard, in reference to the Mississippi Choctaw who moved up to this area. And here we're planting a lot of native plants as well as heirloom varieties of domestic crops, but also starting education programs and reinvigorating the Choctaw Nation here in St. Louis. We're going to be writing signs in English Choctaw, and we also want to honor those first people here, so they're also going to be written in Osage too. And I've reached out both to the Choctaw Nation and the Osage who are going to be helping with that. With the Kansas City Indian Center, we've also supplied them with tools and equipment, trees, shrubs, as well as seeds in their food sovereignty programs. And we're trying to expand that and help them as best we can in a number of ways, and including fundraisers. And then finally, one of the things which is also very exciting, we're also looking at bison pasture and how that can be pollinator friendly. So we got a grant through the St. Louis Zoo to start looking at creating more native habitat for bison. We're initially working with the Omaha Nation. We're going to be reseeding half of their bison pasture in native grasses, sedges, and forbs, which is going to be better for the soil, better forage for the bison, as well as better habitat for pollinators and other wildlife too. And part of it may be just that hopefully the bison even like it. Matanajin Standing Bear once said the buffalo like to wallow their big heads in the sunflower, and many times saw them with long stems wound around about the left horn, for they never wore them on the right horn. Perhaps they did this to decorate themselves, or maybe they like the smell of the flowers. We only know that they like the sunflower. And then most recently, to finish up, we're trying to get a better idea of what the needs and wants are of people across Indian country. And we did a survey. We got a limited amount of results, but through that, we've found a number of things which are important for us as we continue, that bees are important, both personally and culturally. They are seen as relations. Many people know about what they pollinate, though some have identified corn and grains as being bee pollinators, so additional education is needed. People want more information on bees' needs, because only honeybees require a hive, all these others require habitat and other nesting sites. All are interested in learning more. They all are interested in more workshops, webinars, on bee biology, habitat, traditional food, seed savings, and then, of course, resources too. Sometimes people are limited either by the seeds and plants available, sometimes the tool, or sometimes it's just time. We're hoping to get more information. The Tribal Pesticide Program Council, the EPA, is now going to be posting this survey on their website that they're redesigning. So hopefully we'll get more information to be able to direct our programs more effectively. Because we need to know that we need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. We need to restore honor to the way we live so that when we walk through the world, we don't have to avert our eyes with shame, so that we can hold our heads up high and receive the respectful acknowledgement of the rest of Earth's beings. And with that, I thank you for allowing me to present on what I find one of the most exciting and enjoyable programs that has the ability to expand across a variety of areas and to help people who are in need. I've also included my email address here for those who think about questions or have comments or other things, can get in touch with me at the St. Louis Zoo, or you can contact the organizers of the conference to get more information about me. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spevek. Our next speaker is Kevin Shelton with Oklahoma State Extension. Kevin, I'm going to go ahead and give you presenter privileges.
Okay.
And Dr. Spevek, please check your chat box as well. While he's getting set up, we'll see if there's any questions. I don't have anything in my chat box, but you may check yours as well.
Currently, I don't see anything.
Okay, well, if anything comes up, I'll let you know after our last presenter, and we can just go over and make sure there's no other questions.
Thank you.
Kevin, the floor is yours.
Okay, did everything come through?
Yes, just go ahead and put it in presenter or slideshow mode.
How's that?
We're still seeing this other slides on the left-hand side.
Better?
No, not quite. Did you hit from beginning on the left-hand side?
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Hey, Kevin, this is Justin. Basically, put it in presenter mode before you share your screen.
Ah, gotcha. Started to say we had that working the other day.
If you have multiple screens, make sure it's in the presenter mode and choose the screen that the presentation is on.
Yeah.
Perfect. You're good to go.
How's that?
Yep.
All right, eventually we'll get that. All right, my name's Kevin Shelton. I'm with the Pesticide Safety Education Program here at Oklahoma State University, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody about labels or pesticide labels. And I've entitled this, why do I need labels? And if you think about it, pesticides or the label, pesticide label, is actually a guidebook or an instructional book. So if you get something, you want to know how to use it, all that information is on the label. And it took a lot of dollars for these companies to develop these products and to come up with these labels. And so it's extremely important for everybody to read the label when they're using products, especially new products, if they're not familiar with it. And so we often think of, oh, the label's on the product container. Well, that's true. That's the label. That's what's attached to the container. But the labeling is also considered part of the label, and that's any little booklets that you would get with the product. If you have to go online to download something, if you're using some of the fumigants, you'll have to download a little, it's like a 60 or 70 page booklet on there. And so that's considered labeling, but it's all part of the label. And so why do we need to know how to do this? It has a lot of information. If you're using, I want to say for private applicators, restricted use products, or even commercial applicators, you have to keep records. And so a lot of this information on the label you're going to need for your record keeping. And I want to throw up some graphics here right quick. I've got some pesticide complaints for the last year, and it's broken down. Ag plant 71, ornamental and turf 22. You've got termites 17 complaints, and this is with the Department of Agriculture. And I think the total was 135 last year. Other than the ag plant category, a lot of these complaints dealt with label violations, or a lot of them were just record keeping or filling out your stuff correctly. And so, the label is important to read and be able to do that. And let me dump here, and just for kind of gives you an idea of what complaints are filed with the Department of Ag. Right now, by and far, most of the complaints, especially for the last 4 or 5 years, have been in the ag plant category. And you see the rest of them down there. Ag plant was up quite a, fairly high in 2018 and 19. Most of the rest of the ones, are down there about 20 or so and below a year. And so that's been kind of the average the last few years. And that just kind of gives you the total there. And then this last one, I've been able to record these complaints, and we can go back to 1981. And if you look at the green line, by and far, that's where we had the most complaints. And that was actually in our structural category. And so, we started out, over 350, in 82, 83. And then that's kind of gone up and down. We started doing our pest control classes, or our certification classes, in 2000. And you'll start to notice a huge decrease in this. And so we really stress a lot of the label information in these classes. And so education does work. And so you can actually see the complaints go down in a couple of the categories. All the other ones combined. Ag plants kind of gone up and down for various reasons over the last few years, but you can definitely notice the structural and the general pests and stuff. So the educational classes work. All right, get back to our label. In Oklahoma, if you're a commercial applicator, no matter what you use, whether it's restricted use products or general use, you have to keep records. And so the Department of Ag has a list of information that you have to keep on each and every application. And so some of this, start and stop time, place of each application, the name and address of the applicator, name and address of the person for whom the application was applied, legal description of the land or 911 address, the date of the application, the rate, dilution rate, total amount of pesticide used, total amount of tank mix used, the complete trade name of the product, EPA registration number, adjuvants, if you used any adjuvants and if they were required by the label to be added to that, you have to put that down on your records, and also any drift reduction agents. If it was required on the label, you have to list that on your records. The target pest, what you were going for, the site where the pesticide was applied, and that is extremely important, and I'll get to that later when we look at a copy of a label. Any REIs or restricted entry intervals, that means when can you go back in without, a lot of personal protective equipment. Copy of the label, and then any copies of any contracts issued, which only really matter in a couple of categories on the contracts. And then that was for commercial. And so I'm not going to read the list over for private applicators, but there's pretty much the same. You don't have to do the place, name and address of the private applicator. You don't have to put the address of the person for whom applied, since you're using it on your own, agricultural lands, and then you won't have any contracts issued to yourself. And I do want to stress on the private applicator, this is for restricted use products only. If you're using general use products, you're not required to keep records. And this is a big change from back in the, I think, 1992 Farm Bill. USDA had 5 or 6 things that you had to keep records on. That went away, and then so the Department of Ag kind of modified their commercial applicator records. And so this is what you see now. And this has been into effect, I guess, for the last, probably 2 or 3 years for sure on that. And so if you're a private applicator and you're using these restricted use products, just remember that you do have to keep records on that. All right, so application rate. This is what it went out. If you went out at so many ounces per acre or whatever, you get this off of the label. That's also one of your record keeping requirements. The dilution rate, if you mixed a quart per 20 gallons or a gallon per 100 gallons or whatever, that's your dilution rate. If you're doing smaller stuff, an ounce per gallon or something like that. Total amount of pests, or a complete trade name of this product. You will need that. That comes from the label. EPA registration number comes right off the label. Any adjuvants used comes right off of the label. Same thing for the drift reduction agents. If you're required to use anything, that goes on your record keeping. Target pest, this is going to be on your label. And then down here on the site where the pesticide was applied. Believe it or not, for Oklahoma, the target pest does not have to be on the label. What has to be on the label is the site. And so it's beneficial if the target pest is on there. But a lot of times you'll see, like stinging insects or something like that. So it may not specifically list it. But if you're spraying inside your house, you want to make sure that site is on the label. If you're spraying your grass outside, you want to make sure, either Bermuda grass or fescue or whatever is the site that's on there. And the same thing for crops. You want to make sure if you're applying it to wheat or to corn or to beans or whatever, that crop or the site is on the label. And so that's why that is extremely important. And then any restricted entry interval. A lot of times with agricultural products, especially with the restricted use, you'll get a number of hours. Do not go back into the sprayed area for, a lot of times you'll see 12 hours, 18, 24. There's not a whole lot that I see that's over 24. If you get into the ornamental and turf category, where you're spraying lawns or something, residentially or commercially, a lot of times you'll see keep off until dry. That is actually a restricted entry interval, but it's much less time than some of your agricultural products. Okay, copy of the label. Of course, you're going to need your label to have a copy of the label as it appears on the container. And we're going to take one just for example, and this is Asana. This is used on a lot of your pecan trees and other fruit trees and stuff. And so we're going to kind of look at it and go over what we can actually find out or what we have on the label. You know, first thing we see, if it's a restricted use product, you will see restricted use pesticide up at the top of the label on the container. If it's a general use product, and so there's only two kinds, restricted and general. If you see general use on something, well, you're never going to see general use. You'll see restricted use or it won't have anything. And so if it doesn't have anything on it, you're assured that that is a general use product. Come down, net contents. This tells, you know, by weight, and this is, you know, everything is by weight in the pesticide world. And so this is, you know, 1 gallon of stuff. Active ingredient, you know, S-phenvalerate, on there, your ingredient statements, and then you have your active and your inactive or your inert ingredients down there. It's what's all mixed in there. Any first aid stuff or that you need to know about. And so has a little asterisk there and it said contains xylene. This is going to come up later in the following pages. Registration number, that follows this particular product throughout its life. And so this is always required on the record keeping forms. And so you do get this, you know, off the label. Your establishment number, we used to require, or Oklahoma used to require to put the establishment number down on your records. Not anymore. You'll notice this has a state abbreviation in it, you know, Georgia. This is, so the establishment number is where the product was formulated or where it was, you know, put into a container or, you know, manufactured, something like that. And so those are the two numbers that are going to be extremely important on that. Keep out of reach of children. This is on every pesticide, you know. That's just a statement that's on everything. Your signal word. You know, you've got 3 signal words that you will see on pesticide labels. You know, caution, warning, danger. You know, caution is the least toxic. Danger would be the most toxic. And then the company name, address on there, your product or your brand name that's on there. And then up here, this group 3 insecticide, this talks about the mode of action classification. And so we've got the next page here. This is you know, the IRAC, or the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, and WSSA, Weed Science Society, has the same thing for herbicides. But this talks about the sodium channel modulator, or group 3. And if you look over here, you know, mode of action, you know, group 3, and then this was the active ingredient of that Asana, that particular product. Well, if you look at all these other active ingredients, they have similar modes of action. So if you're trying to avoid, or if you're noticing resistance of something to these products that you're using, it doesn't make sense to switch to another active ingredient that's in this list, because the mode of action is going to be the same. And so what you actually do is you switch to, you know, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, you know, another mode of action. And so this helps break that resistance process. All right, next page gives you your first aid list. You know, if swallowed, call Poison Control Center. If it's inhaled, if what happens if it gets you in your eyes, usually that's, you know, 15 to 20, 30 minutes, you know, rinse out with water. If it's on your skin, clothing, a lot of times it will tell you how to launder your clothes or whatever. And then it has your notes. And then here, down here, you see the contains xylene range, or an aromatic solvent. Vomiting may cause, you know, aspiration or pneumonia. And so sometimes it's better to get rid of it. Sometimes it's not. It may do more damage coming back up. And so you need to be able to get to that relatively quickly. All commercial applicators are supposed to have a copy of each label they have on that vehicle, you know, with them at all times. It's a good idea if you're a private applicator to have that as well. Okay. Any precautionary statements, you know, whether it's, you know, humans or animals or whatever, it's harmful if swallowed, it's harmful if inhaled, don't get an eye, skin, clothing. things like that. Mandatory statements. This happens to be on your personal protective equipment, and you'll notice it says applicators must wear long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes and socks, things like that. Not should, must. Must is enforceable, should is not enforceable on that. Any advisory statements that are on there, users should, it's a good idea to do that, but it's not enforceable. So you should wash thoroughly with soap and water and, what have you. Any environmental hazards, a lot of times you'll see, this product or this pesticide is extremely toxic or highly toxic to fish, aquatic invertebrates, whatever. You do not apply directly to water. Do not apply when weather conditions favor drift. A lot of times it will give you, if it's so many miles per hour wind, you can't apply. Down here, this product is highly toxic to bees exposed to direct treatment. Do not apply this product or allow it to drift into blooming crops if bees are present. And on a lot of your agricultural products now, you'll have a bee box that reiterates these statements. Okay. Directions for use tells you how to apply this product. Ag use requirements, this is where you get your WPS or your work protection standards on this. Do not apply, within REI, that's your 12 hours. PPE is required for early entry into this, and it tells you what PPE is required on that. Any warranty statements that, your product's going to have. Any general information that just talks about the products on that. Gives you some rates up there. Your resistance, that's that group 3 insecticide. And so it does a little bit more on explaining on that. And I know we're going fast, but most of the labels are going to be very similar, and you will find these products or these things on most labels. Any buffer zones, vegetative buffer strip, buffer zone for ground application, buffer zone for aerial application. You'll notice on ground it's 25 feet. From aquatic habitats, you get into aerial applications, that usually goes up, and so now it's 450 feet for many aquatic habitats, and then non-ULV aerials, 150 feet. Wind spray drift, do not apply when wind velocity exceeds 15 miles per hour. On a lot of these products, you will see, and I've seen anything from 5 miles per hour, which in Oklahoma may be kind of hard at times. And I've seen as high as 15 or 20 in some. Most of the labels, 10, 12, 15, that seems to be what I see the most on that. And then you've just got some various stuff for air blast applications that gives you some explanations. And now we get into the sites or specific uses on that. And so just for example, we're going for pecans. Application rate, whether you're using concentrate spray or dilute spray, it gives you the pounds of AI per acre or fluid ounces per acre on that. It also gives you last application days to harvest. You got to have 21 days in there before that last application before you harvest those nuts. And then one of the big things on these, especially when you get into pecan orchards or any type of orchard, if you're also grazing livestock, underneath those trees. If you use this application, do not feed or graze livestock on treated orchard floors. And so you need to keep, cattle, any other animals, out of that area, usually for the whole season if you make that application. And then do not apply more than, how many applications per season. That's pretty much it on the label. And I've got just a few minutes here to finish up, and then I'll be happy to address any questions. I'm going to end up with some of the recent changes with the Department of Ag. And so, there's been some safety changes. And if you remember back, in 1975, this was not uncommon. And today may be a little different there. And so, we'll go through this. So some of the certification changes for private applicator. Prior to 2019, since they instigated this private applicator exam, it was a take-home exam. I mean, you sent in, you got a booklet, had a manual in there, had a take-home test, scorecard, you fill that out, you sent it in, you got your private applicator. Well, with a lot of the certification and training changes with EPA, that changed. So starting January of 2020, private applicators had to complete a closed book exam. Well, then COVID hit, and so a lot of the testing centers closed. And so we had a mechanism for private applicators to do this. Commercial still had to just wait till they could get a spot. So in May, they again started the take-home exam. And then, that continued on into this year, 2021. Well, that did end on June 1st, 2021. So now private applicators go back to the closed book exam, just like the commercial applicators. And so one benefit of a closed book exam, though, is before, while commercial applicators could get continuing education units or CEUs to recertify by that method, private applicators had to retest every year. Now they can get CEUs just like commercial applicators. And so when their cycle is up, they still have to pay, but they don't have to go ahead and retest. And so this is a big incentive to go to some of the extension classes, to some of the courses and stuff put on by the manufacturers or the distributors or whatever. And so it's a good learning experience. And then you've got label specific training. You have to do your dicamba training every year, paraquat training every 2 years if you're using the new formulations of dicamba or any formulations of paraquat. Some of the proposed rules with the Department of Ag, and this mainly affected private applicators. You've had to be 18 all along to be a commercial applicator. And so we do have some guidance now on this. And so certified applicators, service technicians, and this private applicators shall all be a minimum of 18 years of age to make pesticide applications. And so there's finally some guidance or some rules on this. Okay, and I'm going to end up with that. And it looks like I've got just a few minutes left over. And so that's my information. If you just want to, give me a phone call, shoot me an email. We've got a few minutes, and so I'll check the chat box here coming up. But let's see if I can get back to the regular stuff here. Here we go. And looks like we've got some stuff in the chat here. Okay. Any questions that you can think of?
And attendees, you're not able to unmute yourself, so if you have questions, please put those in the chat box. And you can direct them to Kevin, or you can send them to myself or Karen. We can make sure he gets those questions.
If Starway, you can contact your host here, and they can provide you with my information. If you want to call me or if you want to email me, either one's fine. But I do appreciate the chance to speak.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Our next speaker is Justin Talley with Oklahoma State University. Justin, I have given you presenter privileges.
Okay, thank you. Is everything showing up?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. Again, I'd like to say thank you for having me. My name's Justin Talley. I'm an extension entomologist specializing in veterinarian and public health entomology. I'm also part of this, what we call these Western Gulf Center of Excellence for vector-borne disease. That's a center of excellence associated with CDC. And so there's all these regional hubs that we provide trainings. We provided some trainings in 2019, very limited trainings in 2020, and then I have started back again. So if you want to just look up Western Gulf Coast Gulf Center of Excellence for Vector-Borne Diseases, the website will pop up, and you can go to some more specialized trainings that we go from anything from mosquito identification to tick identification to how to develop certain sampling plans if you want to see if the vectors are increasing in the area. But and I can help with that as well. But today I'm just going to be focusing on ticks and how and really tick-borne disease and how it's related to public health. So again, to get us started off, I wanted to kind of highlight a grant that we've just finished up. It was called Native Americans trained in various entomological entomological sciences. I was on this grant. I was the main veterinarian entomologist on this and public health, and we had a cohort of 5 Native American students that we fully funded through this program for their 4-year education. And of course, they have a degree. So this is Taylor and Alexis Coles that were a part of this program. Taylor is going on to medical school, and Alexis is looking into some graduate schools. And then we had the other ones. One is going into the Navy as a special officer training. The other one is actually working for a tribe as an outreach coordinator. And then the other one is still finishing up her degree here, and then she will be done in the fall. But we did this because, again, there's always a call for multicultural scholars, and this is a really good program. Again, Taylor and Alexis graduated just this past May, and so Dr. Wyatt Hoback was the lead on this. He's our main educational director for our entomology undergrad program. So, but it's a very good program. Unfortunately, I was in charge of what we call their culminating experience, which we were going to take them down to Panama to view different science labs down there, but visit different indigenous areas and immerse them with tribes that were in and around this in Panama, but that was planned for 2020, so we had to cancel that because of restrictions. But we had this program. It was a very successful program and we're going to start another program as well where we focus on Native Americans to get them trained in different sciences. We've expanded it to other agricultural fields. But again, I'm from Oklahoma. If you think about Oklahoma, we're a tiki state. I'd say anywhere, if you're pretty much anywhere in the eastern half of Oklahoma, Arkansas, all the way going down into the southeast and up to the Ohio valleys into the Atlantic coast, you're going to encounter several ticks. And so, again, here's an example of Oklahoma. We get news headlines all the time that we're always kind of in a kind of state of increased tick presence. We've even had the media pick up on what we call severe tick-borne disease. This individual lady was in and around central Oklahoma, and she was bitten by a tick and was diagnosed with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but her diagnosis came late and she went into sepsis. And I don't want you to think this is like a comorbidity issue. This was a very healthy, active woman in her 40s that just didn't address this tick-borne disease, which is very important because sometimes we see ticks, we know that ticks are around us, we know that ticks get on us, but our biggest issue is what are we going to do to make sure that we don't get severely ill from a tick bite or tick-borne disease. So when we think about the overview of tick-borne diseases, this is kind of a snapshot. This is like the 2019. That's the last time they kind of developed these maps. Of course, everything in CDC switched to COVID, so they haven't updated these for 2020. So in general, if you want to think about anaplasmosis and babesiosis, that can be related to the specific ticks, as well as Lyme disease. A lot of people think Lyme disease is everywhere, but really it's mainly concentrated in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. And that's really related to how the tick that transmits that feeds on certain kind of animals. Whereas in the Oklahoma, the tick that can transmit Lyme disease is feeding on reptiles, and which reptiles don't harbor the pathogen. So, but we are in this area, specifically Oklahoma, Arkansas, over into Tennessee, into the North Carolinas. We're in that what we call a tick belt there, and essentially spotted fever, rickettsia, or what a lot of people call Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then ehrlichiosis. And these two conditions can be lingering, mild, and severe all in one. And so today I'm just going to talk to you about what ticks are involved, some things to think about when you're out and about, and just which pathogens are associated with which specific tick, and why we see transmission in areas, in some areas we don't. So in what we call vector-borne disease, we have this classic triad disease where you have a host, which is us, or which are humans, that interacts with the agent. It could be a pathogenic agent such as bacteria, virus, a toxin, or anything. And in this case, most tick-borne disease, with the exception of a couple, are bacteria in their nature, but we also have some viruses. And then how did all those interact with the environment? What's allowing that to increase the risk or decrease the risk, or why are we seeing more cases, or why are we seeing what we call more case morbidity rates? So people that are actually reporting symptoms and illness all in one. But when you really think about this disease triad, this agent and host is really kind of at the level plane and how it interacts with the environment. And why I put this up here is because even our own human behaviors can influence why we're increasing our risk. There is a reason why we tend to see more risk in certain times of year. It's not just because of the seasonality of the ticks, but it's all because in some areas, especially in Oklahoma, we could have ticks present all year long, but we don't have heavy tick-borne disease starting until spring and really ramping up at this time of year and going into the fall. And one of the reasons is that's because human activities are they're increasing their outdoor activities. And so there is some human behavior involved with this, but then the pathogenic agent. And so how we see these things progress through the season is that it's not a matter of if the pathogen's present, it's how high the pathogen load is present in a particular area. And particularly if you think about this, we kind of consider this an extension or an epidemiological triad of vector-borne disease. We still have this classic triangle that you have hosts, which are animals, and sometimes they could be reservoir hosts and like mice or deer, and then it can come into dead-end hosts, such as humans and other animals that can get tick-borne disease. And then the agent, how the agent, which is the pathogen, the bacteria or virus, how that interacts not only with us when we get infected with it, but with the tick itself. So again, tick biology and behavior is very important. That's why I put this life cycle over here, where you see that sometimes we don't have the correct life stage of the tick present, is why we don't see a lot of tick-borne disease. So you don't have the agent and vector present that can transmit that. And then we have the vector. And then, of course, what I've been talking about, the vector is known as the ticks. A lot of cases, it could be, when we talk about vector-borne disease, we're really talking about either ticks or mosquitoes. Those are our two main things when it comes to human public health. But it's really what we call the nidus, where all of these meet within the environment. And so that's what's really important about tick-borne disease is you may have the pathogen and you may have susceptible hosts, which are us, but the environment and the vectors may not be favorable, so you don't have transmission occurring. But when you have all of these occurring where transmission can happen, that's when we need to be a little bit of have a little bit of concern, and that's when we see what we call some seasonality to this. And so the natural history of disease is just kind of explaining, okay, where it's at and how it's related to us as humans. So we always have a susceptibility stage and how that disease or that pathogen progresses. And then we get into the subclinical stage, which can be hard with tick-borne disease. But then because we don't even realize we're infected, and then we become symptomatic. And so what impacts all of this on the pathogen side is how infectious is it, which can then be related to the last point, the virulence of either the bacteria or the virus, and then the pathogenicity of it. And so pathogenicity is really talking about, okay, yeah, you got an agent that's infectious, you got a virulence factor that makes it either more or less infectious, but then the pathogenicity is all related with both of those and how it interacts. And so how this kind of correlates back to tick-borne disease and ticks is, okay, so you get bitten by a tick, and then you notice, oh yeah, you notice it, you may not, you've been outside all day working outdoors or in a natural habitat, just enjoying nature. And so you get a tick on you. Happens to a lot of us. And so you have that, you remove that tick, but then you don't realize you may have some kind of tick-borne disease because you're in this subclinical stage, which is when you get to symptoms, hopefully you go to the doctor if they're severe, or you manage them with something. This period from the time you're bitten, from the time that a person shows symptoms, is what we call the incubation period. And this is very important because that's why some ticks are more efficient at this, because they're more aggressive biters, and then how this incubation period makes them a viable kind of a vector-borne disease. And so that's very important. Incubation period can be as few as 24 hours to as long as 5 to 7 days before you start showing symptoms. So it's important to kind of understand the natural progression of just diseases overall, and especially tick-borne disease. So the first tick I'm going to talk about is the Lone Star tick, because that's probably our most prevalent tick in our area that seems to cause a lot of problems that we encounter a lot. And basically it's widely distributed through the southeast, Midwest, and along the Atlantic coast. We could probably update this map and show that we found Lone Star ticks all the way up almost into the Panhandle. And so depending on the seasonality, but these are the small white, they're smaller ticks as an adult that have this white dot, and that means that's the female. Only the female has that white dot. The males are somewhat smaller. And again, we see these things all around. They can bite us. They're very aggressive biters. So sometimes you'll be walking along a path, and then you just realize, you have hundreds of these things all over you. My colleague calls these tick bombs, because you're out there walking. You could be on a path, or if you go off the beaten path, especially, then you could just walk into these tick bombs. And I'll tell you, where we see these really high concentrations of these ticks in pastures, state parks, and so forth, is where we see an increase in deer trails or deer habitat. So when we think about the Lone Star tick, it's very much involved in ehrlichiosis. Also a new virus known as the Heartland virus that we've had here in Missouri, Kansas, in Oklahoma, and it's been found positive in tularemia, and then of course this thing that we call star eye that I'll talk to you a little bit more. The nip and adult females are the most frequent to bite to transmit disease, which is somewhat different than other types of ticks, but the females are aggressive biters. So you'll see this along, again, we call this the Lone Star tick because it has that single white dot in there. The next tick that's a major issue is the American dog tick. It's Dermacentor variabilis. This is the main tick that's involved in transmitting spotted fever rickettsiosis. So we certainly need to be aware of this, the seasonality of this. It transmits tularemia, but again, this is a tick that's very active in the spring and summer. Again, adult females are more likely to bite humans than the male ticks because they need what we call a complete blood meal. And both of those ticks are what we call 3-host ticks or multiple host ticks. So that means to complete their life cycle, they'll feed on maybe 3 different hosts. So they could start off on small mammals to moderate sized mammals to large mammals to finish their life cycle. So that's another complicating factor. They're not just on one particular host, but on multiple hosts. And then another one that we see a lot in this area is the Gulf Coast tick. And really the main thing, this is a larger tick. It's larger than the ones I've shown you, but it's an amblyomma tick, so it's related to the Lone Star tick. But in particular, we see it's related to a particular rickettsia called Rickettsia parkeri that is different than like the Rocky Mountain spotted fever rickettsia. But you form a rash that comes with this, but the symptoms can be, somewhat mild, but we can have severe reactions to these as well. Again, adult ticks have been associated with the transmission of this, but the immatures, especially the larvae, will tend to feed on ground-dwelling birds. So that's why they're not involved as much in some of our other tick-borne pathogens. But this one, you'll find it on yourselves, and certainly we find it on a lot of animals, especially if you work with cattle. This is the one that gets in the ears of cattle, and you could get this one on you as well because we see it a little bit higher populations in cattle pastures. And then the infamous black-legged tick that's associated with a lot of different things. This is the Ixodes tick. As you can see, it transmits a whole list of different things, including the causative agent of the Lyme disease. There's a multitude of different Borrelias, but mainly the main Borrelia that causes Lyme disease is Burgdorfii, and that's this tick can easily transmit this. Again, the greatest risk is the spring, but however, adults. We see more adults in kind of cooler times, so like fall and winter. So it's the immature stage that we're more concerned about on this particular tick than the others, but it's widely distributed across the southern plains, and into the eastern part of the U.S. And then a tick that is what we call a domesticated tick because it's affiliated with dogs, especially in dogs in around kennel areas. And so the brown dog tick is a rhiptocephalus tick. This is our main tick, and so why we see it all across the U.S. is because we find it in dwellings. It did cause some issues along the U.S.-Mexico border with a pathogen it hasn't been associated with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So that's kind of a new development, but it is because we had a lot of stray dogs. And I'll tell you, this is important because it severely impacted those on reservations in those areas, especially in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. We even had fatalities, not just sick individuals, but we had individuals that passed away because we had a lot of this Rocky Mountain spotted fever being transmitted by this tick in close associations with dwellings on reservations because the dogs were again inside with the individuals and had this tick. So when we think about Lyme disease, this is probably the one we hear about the most. Again, you can see where Lyme disease has been found throughout the years, but it tends to be more concentrated in the upper Midwest and Northeast, and that's because this particular tick is the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick, is feeding on alternative hosts in the South. We can still get some Lyme disease positives, but we very rarely get them as much as you see in the upper Midwest and Northeast. And so I just want to caution you, just because you have a rash, because you know you've been bitten by tick, it may not be Lyme disease, especially in this area. And so the thing to think about this tick and why it's so good at transmitting Lyme disease is because the nymphs can feed on an infected mouse and then stay infected, which will then infect the larvae of subsequent generations. So here again, here's a life cycle of a black-legged tick. Again, multiple years, multiple seasons, but it's the springtime period and the summertime period that we're worried about because we have these more aggressive feeders that can pass it on from stage to stage to these different life stages. Lyme disease. Again, we hear about this. It can cause a lot of severe long-term neurological effects. 80% of the cases you get this typical bullseye ring, but sometimes you'll get swollen areas, especially like around the lymph nodes and any kind of node area. Weeks to months later, you can have further joint pain and even arthritis in about 10%. About less than 10%. So again, the incubation period is long on this one. So you could be bitten by a tick and you wouldn't start showing symptoms up to 14 days later. So it's important to kind of remember what tick bit you. And in fact, I will also tell you, save your ticks. If you pull a tick off of you, put it into a freezer, and then you could, if you start developing symptoms up to 14 days later, you know what tick bit you, which will help your physician and help those that work on tick-borne disease kind of narrow it down a little bit quicker. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is another one that is very prevalent in this area. Again, in 2019, we had over 5,000 cases. Incubation period can vary, but again, the American dog tick is the main thing. Muscle pain. If it's not treated with an antibiotic within the 5 days, you can have very severe symptoms. And in this case, with that individual from that young lady from Oklahoma, it could lead to sepsis and lead to appendages having to be amputated. So again, most bacterial diseases that are known as tick-borne disease, like anaplasmosis or ehrlichiosis and spotted fever rickettsiosis, can be treated with some type of antibiotic, usually doxycycline, because it's more broad spectrum and it tends to treat these a little bit better. Anaplasmosis, again, can be transmitted by the black-legged tick and another tick that's on the western coast. It's another Ixodes tick. There's a little over 2,000 cases in 2019. That's again not the highest, but I'd say 2017 was probably the highest. But you can have anything from abdominal pain to feeling tired to a cough to even neurological confusion, and that's usually associated with a high fever. Again, this is a tick-borne, but again, it's mainly up in the upper Midwest and Northeast. And again, that's where we tend to see higher amounts of this particular tick, more so than we see down here in the Southern Plains and the Southeast. So the tick's important because the tick biology can drive some of this. That's why we tend to see these more regional impacts. Again, transmitted by Ixodes ticks, but mainly the black-legged tick, that's also known as a deer tick. Ehrlichiosis is a major problem down here that, again, is transmitted by the Lone Star tick and the black-legged tick. Incubation period, again, ranges from 5 to 14 days, so you can be bitten by a tick 14 days before you start showing symptoms. And then it's what we call it, where we see high case fatality rates is usually those with comorbidities. So those are dealing with some kind of ailment, or in very young and very old patients. Again, there's gastrointestinal symptoms that go along with this, along with fever. But this can be treated with an antibiotic because it's caused by Ehrlichia chaffiensis mainly. There's some other Ehrlichias, but this is mainly transmitted by the Lone Star tick, which we have a lot of. Star eye. This is a condition known with tick-borne disease. It's called Southern Tick-Associated Rash Illness. It shows this same bullseye pattern as like Lyme disease, but there's no Borrelia. There's no pathogen that causes that. Again, they thought it was a Borrelia Lone Star eye, but there's some evidence that it's not directly linked to this. There's all kinds of bacteria. Mainly the causative agent is really unknown, but it's transmitted by Lone Star ticks instead of black-legged ticks, whereas Lyme disease is transmitted by black-legged ticks. Again, resolves with antibiotic treatments very easily, but it is transmitted by Lone Star ticks. Just to kind of a comparison, a difference between star eye and Lyme disease, they did a study that patients with star eye were more likely to recover or to recall a tick bite more so than Lyme disease. The time period from the tick bite is usually shorter than with star eye versus Lyme disease. Star eye patients with this typical migraines pattern were less likely to have other symptoms, whereas Lyme disease, you had rash and other things going on. Again, star eye patients were less likely to have multiple skin lesions. They would just have kind of centralized around that initial tick bite. Again, after antibiotic treatments, star eye patients recover more rapidly than those suffering from Lyme disease. And I put this up here. Star eye is transmitted by Lone Star tick, not the black-legged tick, but black-legged tick is what's transmitting Lyme disease. So just kind of a comparison. We see those both down here. Tularemia, we see tularemia a lot. Again, Lone Star tick and American dog tick. This is usually associated with handling of rabbits, or if you have areas with a lot of wild rabbits, and sometimes rodents, but it can cause skin ulcers, not just the typical rashes. In Oklahoma and Arkansas, in this area, has usually higher amounts of case rates than other parts of the U.S., but certainly this two types of ticks that can transmit this, so kind of two different seasons, but mainly we see this with the Lone Star tick, and especially with when you have a lot of rabbits around. Heartland and bourbon virus, these are the two things. These are not bacteria. These are the two new viruses. As of 2017, when these things were first discovered, we've had 30 cases in Midwest and through the South. Again, it's associated with the Lone Star tick, no other tick. Incubation period is variable, but most patients report it within like that 14-day period. So it's important to save the ticks for at least 2 to 3 weeks. So 2 to 3 weeks, you're out of that incubation period for most of our tick-borne pathogens, even these new viruses. But mainly this one has like a headache associated with it, which it can be associated with viruses. But again, really the main thing I wanted to kind of share with you is that these are the main ticks, the main tick-borne disease viruses that are associated with this. Try to leave some time for questions. If there's any questions, I'll answer those. Let me look at the chat. I don't see anything with the chat, so are there any questions?
Justin, go ahead and check your chat box and make sure you haven't received anything on your end.
Okay, let me.
Oh, I have one.
Oh, okay. Let me look.
I have one in my box as well.
Okay.
What is the best repellent?
Okay, great question. So the best repellent for ticks is going to be DEET, and DEET at a concentration of 30% or higher. If you do not like DEET, you can use some of our more natural-based products, but you'll just have to reapply them more often. So if you're out there, if you're just enjoying the natural area and you know you're in and around ticks and you do not want to put DEET on, you can put a natural repellent on like any of these kind of there's just a whole litany of, but you have to apply them more often. And I'll tell you, they're not as effective against ticks as they are for mosquitoes, but DEET is the best one. And then if you're in an area, if you're in a natural habitat where you know you have to be in and among like vegetation where there's ticks, it's what we call the picaridin or the pyrethroid treated clothing. Again, hunters do that. So you treat the clothing, not yourself, and then it keeps the ticks off of you the best.
Do you spray pets as well? That's another question.
No, your pets should have some kind of product on them, either a collar or a spawn on. I tell you, in heavy tick areas, the long-lasting collars seem to be the best and most effective. So if you have, especially dogs, if you have dogs that are going out there with you, doing going on trails, or just taking your dogs out there, these long-lasting collars. I'm not promoting this one, but just an example of that is Seresto, but they tend to work better against ticks. There's some spot on and even consumables that you feed that are really good and still good. But when we're seeing like working dogs that are going out there with like ranchers and stuff, going into really heavy tick laden areas, those collars tend to work the best.
Okay, I got another one. How did people repel ticks back in the day, long before DEET and such?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's some literature out there that says certain flowers could be used if they put flowers on them. Some people kind of go by this adage that there's certain things that will repel, and that was probably the case. But I'll tell you what probably happened is that their immune system was just more adapted. They were exposed to it more, and so their immune system had to adapt to survive. And those that couldn't, again, that's why we had lower life expectancies. And I'd say tick-borne disease was probably one of those that just went unaccounted for, that especially in this area, especially with Rocky Mountain spotted fever and ehrlichiosis. So yeah, before we had all these like synthetic compounds, there's some literature out there that they use native plants. Nobody has really developed a whole list of these, but like anything that had lavender or the chrysanthemum flowers or stuff like that tended to be in historical literature that had some repellency against both mosquitoes and ticks.
Awesome, thanks. I actually have a question myself.
Yeah.
So, as somebody that is a mosquito buffet per se,
Yeah.
and 40% DEET does not work
Mhm.
in repelling them, how bad is 100% DEET on your skin?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's just like Kevin Shelton's talk. Read the label. You don't ever want to put the 100% DEET on you. So here, I'll give you an example. So I was in Ecuador doing a project, and we setting up some agreements with other universities, and we were in the rainforest for a while, and certainly we had yellow fever mosquitoes, we had malaria mosquitoes, we had all those around us because we were in the kind of the thick of the rainforest. And it was like a 70% DEET product. And I accidentally, I was spraying kind of my clothing, but when I did one spray, it hit kind of parts of my face, and my lips just went into this tingling sensation that I knew it wasn't the best. So don't ever put 100% DEET on you. So for somebody that attracts a lot of mosquitoes, I'll tell you one of these products that works well, especially if you want to enjoy the outdoors. Doesn't work well if you're walking a lot, but if you're just sitting on a patio, or these diffusers, you can get them at Walmart. It kind of uses a heat cell, and there's a low level of permethrin that's called allothrin. I know they have them at Walmart, or like any of these like Cabela's or any of these type Bass Pro Shops, and you just put them out there, and it gives you up to a 10-foot protection for mosquitoes. It does.
Awesome, good to know.
Yeah.
So I don't see any other questions in my chat box. So you may just check yours, make sure you didn't receive any from anybody directly.
Okay, I opened my chat box and it just has one individual wanting to share our slide sets, and that's all that's there.
Okay, well, then if anyone has any questions after the fact and you want us to direct them to Justin or Kevin or Dr. Spevek, then please let us know. But with that, oh, here's another question. And this will be our last one. So we have another conference or another breakout session after this. So one last question, and it is, I've heard mosquitoes prefer people that produce more CO2. Is that factual? And are ticks attracted in a similar way?
That is factual. So people that have a higher respiration rate, so if you breathe heavy, then you will attract more mosquitoes and more ticks. They use the same. They use long range cues, and the long range cues is carbon dioxide that we release. There's studies actually out there that show that people that have high respiration rates, either related to their weight or even to drinking alcohol, will attract more mosquitoes and to a certain extent more ticks if the ticks are in the area. So yeah, that's a fact. And so if you're out there and you're out there exercising, especially in the evening time, just know that you could have the likelihood of attracting more because you're breathing more heavily.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Justin.
Yep.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, Dr. Spevek. We appreciate you guys coming on with us today. And this has been recorded, so it will be available for you guys to view after the fact if you'd like. And our next session is going to be starting at 10:30 with conservation efforts, and hope to see you guys there. Thank you, guys.
Okay, appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. See you guys later.